Okay, so this week we are starting a section on inequality. This section is looking at how sociologists view inequality, what they study, how they study it, and just in general, what does it mean to have an unequal or equal society? We start this week with crime and deviance, specifically looking at how in the U.S. we've created categories of crime and how we've created it to how the categories of crime lead to inequality. Um, I didn't realize this until this week, and so I didn't change it. But I wanted to do this week after the next one. Next week is when we actually review definitions of inequality and social stratification. So don't worry about the specific definitions yet. We can just think of inequality right now as um, an unequal access to benefits or to social privileges. We'll just think about it like that. But next week, we'll get specific definitions when we look at economic inequality. But today, we are going to go over how the US has constructed the definitions of crime, how they've constructed different types of crime. And when I say constructed, we have to think back to this idea that often in society we create the meanings and the categories that shape our reality. So just like gender or race is shaped by the meanings that people in power and that systems give us, so is crime something that is created. It is not necessarily something that is obvious or something that is inherent in society, but it's something that's we as individuals create and give meaning to. So that's why you see in different nations and in different societies and in different tribes, different kinds of things that are considered deviant or criminal because it depends on the morality or the values of each group. In the US, we will see how people in power and in politics have created a very particular form of crime and deviation. So let's start with, since we're looking at mass incarceration, just get a broad facts. This is a from 2010, the looking at the incarceration rate of different countries, and oops, sorry. And when we look at incarceration rates, what that means is for every 100,000 people, how many of those people are in jail, are actually in prison? And so we see on the low end, we have countries like India, Japan, that for every 100,000 people, only about 30 or 50 are incarcerated. That's a fairly low rate. However, once we get closer to the right side, we see that there are some higher countries with higher rates, like Russia and Cuba, that have almost or around 500 people for every 100,000. Um, that means that for every 100,000 people, 500 of those will be in jail. The US, however, has the highest rate at 700 people per 100,000. Now, it gets even more drastic when we look at Black Americans and Black American men. So if we look at 100,000 Black Americans, 2,000 of those, over 2,000 of those, will be incarcerated at any given time. So that's about 2% of the Black American population is incarcerated at any time. When we look specifically at Black American men, for every 100,000 Black American men, 4,300 are incarcerated at any given time. So around 4.5% of Black American men are incarcerated at any given time. That does not just mean people with a criminal record. That's actually people who are in prison. So if we looked at the people who have criminal records, the number explodes. If I'm not mistaken, it's around a third or even more than a third for Black American men are have criminal records, and so it's a huge number that is vastly different than most of the entire world. Really, the only people we compare to is Russia and Cuba. But when we look specifically at Black America, there's no comparison. There's this extreme incarceration rate. Michelle Alexander, she is a legal scholar. She went and she was like, well, why did this happen? How did we get to a point where we incarcerate more than any other country. And when we look specifically at Black Americans, we incarcerate more than most countries combined. So what's going on here? And so she actually goes all the way back and finds that the way we talk about race and crime has its origins in the new Jim Crow. Um, the Jim Crow. The Jim Crow laws were a suite of laws and of policies enacted after the Civil War to continue and restrict Black suffrage and Black participation in society. So they would create a lot of unique crimes that only Black people would commit, whether that is being unable to read, whether that is, talking to someone of the opposite race. All of these things were established as crime to give Black Americans some kind of criminal record and disenfranchise them. In the piece on in the section from the new Jim Crow that I have you read, we jump to how this is playing out in the mid 1900s. So even though the civil rights movement is happening, there's a larger amount of America that is trying to push for equal rights between Blacks and whites. There is still a political battle here. So in the 1960s, the civil rights movement was really pushing forward. You had a bunch of groups that you see also in the documentary. You have Martin Luther King's movement. You have sit-ins throughout the South. You have the Black Power movement, which comes a little later. You have Malcolm X pushing for more direct action. You have James Baldwin, right? You have a whole bunch of different groups and people really advocating for a more equitable society. However, because of all these Jim Crow laws, like Black people had to sit in the back of the bus, Black people had to be segregated. For white people, they couldn't drink at the same water fountains. They had to sit at different places or maybe not even be allowed in the same restaurant. In order for a lot of these Black civil rights activists to make movement in society, they had to break those laws. So that's why the sit-ins would have Black people go into racially segregated institutions and just exist and argue, no, I have a right to be here. They would sit at the front of the bus. They would block traffic. They would do huge protests in front of jails or in front of, we had the big one in front of the US Capitol. These were all technically illegal, but based on the construction of crime for each of these states or cities. So we see already that the creation of many of these criminal codes was largely to disenfranchise Black folk. During the 1960s, we had a bunch of politicians who were recognized that public sentiment was moving in favor of equality, but they still didn't want Black people to have all of the rights. And so they moved from a racialized crime rhetoric to something disguised, where they wouldn't necessarily say, we are out to destroy the civil rights movements, to say, we're a nation of law and order. We'll accept people who want change, but you can't break any laws. Even if those laws are you have to sit in the back of the bus, even if those laws are segregation and whatnot. And so they started this frame of, we are for law and order, which really meant we're going to crack down on civil rights protesters to make sure that this isn't happening. Over time, this has changed to include a lot of hidden racist language from crack babies, gangbangers, welfare queens, super predators, etc. And so, even in the civil rights movement, we created in the country a political environment and language to talk about crime as specifically Black. And as something that is, it's Black folk who are the enemy. It's Black folk who are criminal. Sorry, that was too early. But this is what Michelle Alexander is trying to say, is that we've created the idea in this nation that crime is often inherently colored. It is often linked specifically to race. And so when politicians and voters hear terms like law and order, hear terms like gangbangers and welfare queens, the first thing they think of is black folk. Similarly, at the same time, there was a increasing divide in political and academic ideas of poverty and crime, where conservative circles would say that poverty and crime is because of the culture of those communities, specifically black culture. So they would say black culture is problematic, it leads to poverty and crime, whereas more liberal circles would say no, structural conditions are leading to poverty and crime. It's the fact that you are criminalizing. It's the fact that you aren't giving them equal opportunity to get jobs. That's what's leading to poverty and crime. And so this was another way of constructing um, criminality to blackness, saying that it was part of their culture. Um, any question on how the 1960s, 70s constructed the connection between race and crime? Okay.
No.
So then we move on into the 1980s and Reagan's war on drugs. So um, in in 1985 was when we first see crack cocaine really hit the streets in the U.S. However, in 1982 was when Ronald Reagan said, we have a drug epidemic in the country and we need to crack down on drugs. And he declared his war on drugs before anyone considered drugs to be a problem. In fact, when he declared on the war on drugs, less than 2% of the nation felt that drugs was the most important issue of the nation going forward. So he created the idea that drugs were a problem before they were a problem. And what happened with this? First, um, the Reagan administration cut the Department of Justice's emphasis on white collar crimes and corporate crimes and funneled that money into street crimes and drug law enforcement. So the FBI, for example, changed a lot of its investigations from corporate crimes into narcotics or into street level crime. Law enforcement spending skyrocketed, and they similarly cut education and drug treatment out of budgets. So while they were saying drugs were a problem, they decided we should criminalize drug users rather than help rehabilitate drug users. So they increased law enforcement budgets rather than drug treatments and education. Um, then, as they keep going, they come up with increasing penalties for drug crimes, such as the death penalty, the admission of illegally obtained evidence in drug trials. They set mandatory minimums for cocaine and crack. And what a mandatory minimum is if you are guilty of possessing or using cocaine and crack, um, then the judge has to at least sentence you to this minimum. I don't know exactly what the minimums were at that time, but there were minimums saying you could not put this person in prison for less than this many years. Crack cocaine was more used by people of color, whereas powder cocaine was used by whites. And crack cocaine's mandatory minimums were around 16 times more harsh than the mandatory minimums for powder cocaine, so the kinds used by whites. So again, they are focusing their criminalization on black communities rather than white communities. They also created programs that would evict anyone with drug uh, histories from public housing, and they prohibited anyone to apply for a student loan if you had a drug charge. So combining this with the last one, we see in the 60s and 70s this rhetoric about crime is black, it is horrible, we need to stamp it out. And then in the 80s, we saw this intense criminalization of crime or of drugs, in which black communities were not just seen as drug addicts and criminals, but they were the enforcement and penalty for all of these was increased. many times fold. Then in the 90s and the early 2000s, this continued. So this wasn't just a Republican push. Democrats didn't want to seem weak on crime, and this happened throughout the nation. And so they also pushed tough on crime narratives, and in fact, often became harsher than Republican platforms in order to like avoid the idea that they were soft on crime. So in the 1990s, Bill Clinton signed into law a lot of changes. He Reagan had a law called the Three Strikes You're Out, where if you were arrested 3 times with drug felonies, then you were sentenced to life. Clinton changed some of those to say 1 strike and you're sentenced to life. Clinton's administration passed the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act. That's the PRORA acronym there, which changed welfare reform to limit the access to welfare. Now it is only accessible for 5 total years of your life, and any drug felons are immediately banned from accessing welfare. There's a shift again from public resources to prisons and law enforcement, and there's ever more restrictions for public housing for those who have a criminal history. So again, if crime is focused on Black folk, and then all of our penalties are so severe that it disenfranchises all these criminals, quote unquote, then what we are doing is criminalizing Black communities and heaping on these intense penalties rather than helping Black communities have more money, have more job opportunities, and have more ability to escape poverty. So what happens from this is where we're going with inequality. If you look on the left, the 70% of the U.S. population is white, or like almost 70, around 60% is white, around 15 to 20% is Latino, and around 15% is Black. But when we look at the people who are in prison for drug offenses, that doesn't correlate, right? We have more people in prison, especially federal prison, for drug offenses who are Latino and Black than it should be if things were equitable. And this is not because Black and Latino communities use drugs more. In fact, it's the opposite, that often we find that white communities use drugs more often. So these racialized messages and fears of race fueled the war on crime and the war on drugs. And these wars pushed heaping consequences on communities of colors without any real evidence that Blacks or Latinos and Latinas were more criminal or more likely to use drugs. Policy consequences from all of this include things from increasing budgets for drug enforcement, militarization of the police, decreasing budgets for drug rehabilitation, education, social services, expanding the death penalty, authorizing evictions, mandatory life sentencings, restricting welfare, etc. And then to show evidence that this has actually led to inequality, let's look at this analysis from the Prison Policy Initiative. This is showing wealth accumulation by race and incarceration status. So this is saying how much wealth do you accumulate over your lifetime if, on average, for white people, Hispanic people, and Black people, and then divided that up between those who have never been incarcerated and those who have been incarcerated. We see that in 2000, white folk who have never been incarcerated, on average, accumulated wealth over $125,000. Right? So over their lifetime, the average person in 2000, or the average white, never incarcerated person, accumulated around $125,000. For Hispanic folks that were never incarcerated, that's a huge gap. Theirs was less than $50,000. White folk who were incarcerated were third in terms of top wealth accumulation at around $30,000. And then we see Black folk who were never incarcerated barely reached $25,000, and Hispanic and Black folk who were formerly incarcerated do not make over around $12,000 in their entire lifetime. So we see that incarceration really hinders your ability to gain wealth and escape poverty, whereas race for white folk and incarceration, or lack of incarceration, really improves your chances at having a decent life. So inequality or criminality and crime enforcement has really targeted Black individuals and Hispanic individuals and reduced their ability to have decent and non-poverty filled lives. Um, are there any questions on how we moved from politics of race in the 1960s and attacking the civil rights movement to the war on crime and drugs of the 80s and 90s to modern day inequality and mass incarceration? Okay. So, as another example, and this will be short, of how we construct crime and drugs differently, we're going to look at a couple, specifically opioids. So, if you remember, in the mid 2010s, there was this big opioid panic that, oh no, we have a lot of people overdosing or misusing opioids. We need to fix this. Um, so on the left, we see that opioids are mostly used by white folk, they're mostly used by men, and they're mostly used by middle-aged people. And yet, when we don't think of a um, opioids as a crime, we see it as a public health crisis. However, it is just as dangerous, if not more, of things like crack. It has killed just as many people per, 100,000 people. And yet, because crack was more often to be used by Black folk, that was criminalized, whereas opioids were more likely to be used by white folk, and it was seen as a public health crisis. Um, this is going back to the mandatory sentencing. We see on the right, we see cocaine sentences for crack users, which was a more likely to be a Black folk, was much higher throughout the 90s into the 2000s. So in 2006, the average crack prison sentence was 122 months. I'm trying to think of, that's about 10 years. Whereas for powder cocaine, which was more likely to be used by white folk, the average prison sentence was 85 years, which is about, or 85 months, which is about 6 years. So a big difference in crack and powder cocaine sentencing, which has a heavy racial connotation. Um, Netherland and Hansen, I have this article if people want to use it. They called the opioid epidemic the war on drugs that wasn't. And they say in their article, they write, arising in tandem with, rather in tension, the official war on drugs and its mass incarceration of Blacks and Latinos, white opioid images have helped carve out a separate space for white opioid use in the popular American imagination, one that leads to racially stratified therapeutic interventions and works to insulate white communities from Black and brown drug threats, leaving intact law enforcement crackdowns on Black and brown urban residents in the name of public safety. So the idea that what they're saying is by crafting the scenarios of opioids as a public health crisis, it keeps law enforcement out of white communities and continue criminalizing Black and brown communities. So that is what we are talking about this week when we're looking at mass incarceration, the construction of crime, and how it leads to inequality. I will turn off the recording now, but I'm happy to answer any questions.